you a story. Years ago, back when I was living down in Florida, and I was only in my 20s, I used to go to a church, and I met this fella and became friends with their family, and he was a really nice fella. And we used to go fishing. We became fishing buddies. So every Saturday we'd go fishing. And he used to love to fish. Now, he was an older fella. He was in his 70s. And I was only in my 20s. So it's kind of like an odd friendship, sort of thing. But what we held in common was we liked to go fishing. So we used to go out to the ocean and fishing on every Saturday. And he'd come over and with his old car. I'll tell you what happened, his story first, what happened with him. When he was in his 50s, he used to live up in Pennsylvania. And he happened to get sick. He said he wasn't really clear on what kind of an illness it was. I think it was his gallbladder, perhaps. He said that he had to go to the hospital for some sort of an operation. And he was getting thinner and thinner and weaker, and he thought for sure he was going to die. So he decided then, up in Pennsylvania, that he was going to retire to Florida and die there. I guess he thought he was going to drive to Florida, buy himself a piece of land, and build himself a house, and he was going to die there. So he drove to Florida, and he went way out down in the woods down there, and he did it all himself. He started to build this house. And while he was building the house, he started to get healthy again in his 50s. And so I guess it took him a year or two to complete the house, and he built it himself out of cement blocks. It wasn't a very big house, and he built it the way he wanted to build it. It was just basically a square house with a square roof, and all built out of cement blocks. And I guess he cut the brush down himself, and as he was doing all that work, he got well again. And so he went over to this place where he lived was not far from the river, and he met another old fella who owned a fish camp. And they made friends, and he used to like to go fishing every day there. So he lived that way for years. And when I met him, he was about 78 years old, and he was a picture of health, I guess he lived there for 20 years or more back in the woods. But he went to the same church we went to, and that's how I met him and, made friends with him. And he was a kind of really, to tell you the truth, for a 78-year-old man, he was in really good physical condition. I saw him one time. There was a limb up in the air above a tree. He jumped up and grabbed a hold of the limb, and he slowly pulled himself up, and he was on top of the limb. And I never seen young guys do stuff like that, athletic wise, So much for him dying when he was 50. So anyway, he was a picture of health for a man 78 years old. Many a day I saw him go out on the river, and he would stay in the boat all day in the hot sun. It's really hot in Florida, and not drink any water or anything. Just sit there all day and fish, He loved to fish. He would catch these, I guess they were perch or something. They used to be near the bank, near the rocky parts, and near the under the roots and stuff. Down in Florida, it's like mangrove type swamp. It's like these cypress trees grow, and they get these gnarly roots that come down underneath the bank of the river. And these fish like to get down in these little crevices and crannies down in there. And he used to like to get his bait down in there and tempt them out, and get them to bite. I can't remember the name of the fish. They were like a little, I think he called them crappies or something. I can't remember. They're like a little perch or something. He used to like to catch, and some days he'd catch as many as 60 of these fish. So, but when we would go fishing, we wouldn't go fishing in the St. Johns River. We would go down to the ocean, and we would generally go to like New Smyrna Beach or Daytona Beach or Ormond Beach is where we'd like to go. And oftentimes we'd go to the piers or we'd go to the bridges. and had different places we'd like to go to fish, So this day he came over to go fishing, and he had this big old orange Dodge of a car. It was orange colored, and he used to start it with a screwdriver. He'd take the screwdriver and he'd pulled the ignition switch out, and he'd made it somehow so that he'd turn a switch on to give it heat, like underneath the dash. He had this little switch he'd turn on. Then he'd stick the screwdriver in and turn the screwdriver, and it would start the car. It's this old Dodge, and I think it was like a 1966 or 1967 Dodge, but he hadn't driven it much, and it never had a speck of rust on it because it had never seen snow or ice. It was a Florida car, and it was just almost like, it wasn't like new, but it was like a solid old tank of a car, So he'd drive that car over to my house, and then he would unload his gear out of the car, fishing boxes, different kinds of fishing boxes and rods and reels he had and everything, and he would load them into my Pinot station wagon. So I had this old Pinot station wagon I used to drive back then, and I used to use it for construction. I used to build houses. So anyway, on the roof I had this giant roof rack that I used to carry lumber on the roof, and I'd stripped all of the carpets out on the inside, and I used to carry sand in the back end for masonry in the back end of the car, a Pinot station wagon. I used to use that little car really rough. It wasn't a real old car. I think it was a 1978 Pinot station wagon, and or it might have been 1976 or 77. Anyway, it was one of those ones that back in those days they used to say that the gas tanks would blow up on them, and people were scared to buy them. So I bought it cheap because they said that it had some sort of a gas problem or something. Anyway, it was a good little car. It used to run real good. It had a 2.3 liter 4-cylinder engine, had lots of power, and I used to keep the tires inflated up to like 50 pounds pressure because I used to put so much weight in the back end of the thing, and I'd distribute the weight. And believe it or not, sometimes I used to carry as much as a ton inside that car. Of course, when I had a ton of weight in her, she wouldn't go very fast. I used to keep her slow. And I'll tell you one little story about this. One time I took it into they used to have a store. It was like Home Depot, and I was building a patio for somebody and out of pressure treated lumber. And I loaded the lumber all on the roof racks. And so I figured out on the way to the car, I figured out how much weight it was. Calculated it on my calculator. I used to have one of those pocket calculators back then. They were quite expensive, weren't they, back in the day, those pocket calculators? You remember we used to buy the pocket calculators, and they were quite expensive. But I used to had the calculator on the dashboard of the car, so I calculated how much weight I had on the roof. I got inside the car and I sat down on the calculator and figured out how much all the lumber weighed. And it was heavy. It was wet because it had just been pressure treated. And I had I think 100 2x4x8s, and I had 30 2x6x12s and all this kind of stuff. So I sat there and I calculated the weight, and oh my gosh, I got 2,800 pounds. So I was inside the car with all that up on the roof, and I got thinking for a second. I said to myself, what if the roof suddenly collapses? I have 2,800 pounds come down on top of me. So just as I got thinking that, gee, this might collapse on top of my head, I heard this snap sound. It sounded like a 22, like a snap sound on the roof, up on the roof, I got out of that car so quick. Anyway, and then what I did was I took about 30 or 40 of the 2x4s off, and I said, I'll come back and get them later. I said, so I took some of the weight off, So anyway, I used to use that little car hard. I carried so much brick sand in that back end of that little car that the paint all wore off and I tore the back seat out. There wasn't any back seat. I'd torn the back seat out, and I used the whole back end, and I just shoveled the sand inside the back of that car, and I'd look at the tires to see how flat they were, and that's how I'd judge how much sand to put in the back of the car. So on this morning, we were going to head fishing. George threw all of his gear in the back of the little Pinto station wagon, and I threw my gear in the back. And I used to have this old John boat. It was a little 11-foot long John boat that I salvaged at the aluminum scrapyard, where they sold aluminum, and they were selling it to me for the price of the aluminum. And so I fixed the bottom. It had a bunch of leaks in it, so I filled the leaks and patched the holes with epoxy and with fiberglass resin, and I'd repainted the boat green, and I used to carry that boat up on top of the roof rack, and so we had our boat with us, and a couple oars to row the boat around with. I didn't use a motor; it was only a small boat, and so we headed fishing that morning. It was early. He used to come over early, park his car, and we'd head fishing like 7 o'clock in the morning. George was an early riser. That was his name, He used to like to get up really early in the morning. And so there's still dew all over the leaves of the trees and stuff, When we were leaving the house, dew all over the grass. The dew hadn't burned off yet. It was a coldish morning, maybe about 50 degrees. But it was heating up really fast, the temperature. The sun was out, bright blue sky, and it was really warming up fast. So we decided to head to New Smyrna Beach. So we took off, and we were heading down the highway, and George had his arm leaned out the window, and so did I, and we were talking a breeze like we normally do, talking about everything under the sun. And while I was driving along there, we were all the talk and things we were talking about, interested in things that we were talking about. I was just basically like autopilot driving the car, when I'm like that, I'm going to be honest. Sometimes I can miss a turn or whatever because I'm not really paying too much attention to my driving that much. I'm more or less paying attention to what I'm talking about and everything. And so that was that way that morning. I went through D-Land and I missed my turn. George said, "Hey, you better get back there." He says, "We missed a turn, So, okay, we had to turn around again about a quarter mile down the road and go back and catch the right road, So we were still talking a breeze heading on to New Smyrna. So we got to New Smyrna and we went up on the bridge. And I noticed it's getting kind of warm, warm and muggy. It was kind of like the weather was changing. And it was starting to get a little bit cloudy, and there wasn't much biting there, New Smyrna. We put our lines down in the water, and the tide was going out, and we stayed there for a while. We didn't get a bite. There wasn't any fish there, so I looked over at George, and I said, it's not much fish out there today, not much happening. I said, let's go down and let's try Ormond Beach. I said, let's try the pier, or not the pier, but the bridge at Ormond Beach, and we might be able to get some what's called sheep's head. And what sheephead were? They're funny little fish that has these black and white stripes on them. And why they're called a sheep's head is their head has teeth just like a sheep. They almost look like human teeth, and they used to be a fish that used to hang around the pilings of the pier. And they would nibble at the clams and oysters with those teeth that look like sheep's teeth. And they used to anyway. So we decided to go get one of those fish. I said on the way, I said let's stop and we'll stop and get something to eat. So we stopped at a restaurant. And we went through the drive-through, and George got himself some chips. Not chips, but French fries and got himself a hamburger, and he got himself a thick shake, and I got myself a couple things to eat too. And we sat in the car and we had a little something to eat, when we were in the parking lot there. And then we decided to head down to Ormond Beach. So after we got eaten and we got our bellies full, basically fairly full, we started to head to Ormond Beach. So we got to Ormond Beach to the bridge. And we parked down at the base of the bridge with the little Pinto station wagon with the roof on the top, with the boat on the top of the roof. And we got out all our gear, and I noticed that the sky was starting to get a bit dark, and cloudy. And I said to George, it looks like it might rain after a little while. He said, yeah, it looks like it's getting kind of dark and cloudy. So we headed up onto the bridge with all of our gear, and we put our lines in the water, and we were fishing along, and all of a sudden I noticed these fish started to come in from the ocean that were different than what we went there for. The sheep's heads, they weren't there that day, but these other fish started to come in. I can't remember the name of them, but they used to be a brightly colored fish, really pretty fish. They used to swim near the surface, and you could catch them with shrimps. So I put my line down in, and I was trying to catch these fish. And I got about 3 poles going with these baits on, trolling near the surface, trying to catch these fish. And I think I caught one of them. These brightly colored fish are really pretty. They're pretty looking fish. They get really pretty scales on them, and I can't think of the name of them right now, but I think I caught one, right? And all of a sudden, I started to notice these big drops started to fall. Rain, It started to get windy. So I looked over behind me, and I seen this black-looking thing. Never seen anything quite like it before in Florida. This black. It was so black looking. And it was moving toward us really fast. These great big drops were coming out of the sky. And the car wasn't far away. It was only maybe a couple 100 meters, or maybe 600 feet away is all. The rods were up on the pier, And I had 3 rods leaning against the... That wasn't a pier, it was a bridge. 3 rods leaning against the bridge, and George had about 2. And all of a sudden, some hail started to come down. Ice, and it was little balls of ice, about pea-sized hail, I said to George, we better get it for the car, because the wind started to gust, And it was getting really bad fast. So me and George, we hightailed it. We started walking really fast, heading for the car, Well, I'll tell you, I started to run. After I got about halfway to the car, I started to run because the hail was pelting on my back and the wind was really blowing. And George was right behind me. He wasn't wasting any time either. We were both heading for the car. So we got to the car. We jumped inside the car, both of us. And we slammed the doors shut. Well, anyway, I never seen anything like this before. This thing come in off of the river. And it was an inland waterway, this thing, and I'll call it a thing. What it actually was I know what it was now. Back then, I didn't really know what it was, but I know what it was now. It was a water spout. That's what it was. And we were inside the car. Wouldn't you know it, that thing, the water spout, headed right for my car. And we were inside the car, and it started to lash against the car, and it actually started to pick the car up off of its... I could feel it picking the car up off of its springs and shaking the car. And it was thrashing. It was right on top of the car. So I looked up. I kind of twisted my head sideways and stuck my head up on the dash and kind of looked up the windshield, looked up into the thing. And I'm going to tell you, honest to God, I was looking right up inside a funnel. Now, George, I'll tell you, George was almost stone deaf. When George was a younger man, he was a professional swimmer, an athlete. And he got what's called swimmer's ear. Now, this was back in the years back before they had really strong antibiotics or anything, when he got it, when he was a younger man. And I think all they had really was back then was things like sulfa drugs and stuff like that. But he had a really bad case of swimmer's ear, and it had ruined his hearing. He had it so bad because he used to be a professional swimmer. So George was almost stone deaf. And when he had his hearing aids out, he was completely deaf. Anyway, he had 2 hearing aids. So anyway, George is sitting in the car next to me. George couldn't hear what was going on. But I'm going to tell you honestly, it sounded like a freight train was on top of the car, just roaring. It was roaring loudest, and it was sitting right on top of our car. And it was trying to pick the car up. Had the car up off the springs. The next thing I know, I heard these sprong sounds, and it had the boat, and it was twirling the boat around up inside the thing, right above our car. It must have picked the boat up about 100 feet in the air, and it threw it to one side. The boat come down with a clang. Well, a few seconds later, it left. It went off of the car and left and started to move back down the river again, the inland waterway. But it really shook me up. And I looked over at George and I said, "Did you see that?" He said, "Yeah, I saw it." I said, "What did you think of that?" He said, out on the river, he said, "I've been in 2 or 3 or 4 of those before." He said, "What I always do is," he said, "I pull my little boat into the bank," he said, "when it's coming." And he said, "I lay down flat in the boat." And it didn't faze George at all. He didn't think much of it at all. Of course, he couldn't hear the sound of it either, because he's practically stone deaf. So George didn't think much of it, but I'll tell you, I was sitting there and my heart was beating so fast. My heart was going thump, 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 thump. I got out of the car and I was like, I had this kind of it's indescribable, kind of like, I think the feeling was that I was thankful to be alive, to tell you the truth. So I got out of the car with George, and wouldn't you believe it, the sun came out, and the air got right still again, and everything got quiet again. You could see this black-looking thing moving down the river. It was going the other way. And I was, honest to God, thankful to be alive. So I went back up on the bridge, and you know what? All of our poles were still there on the bridge. It hadn't knocked our poles off. But all this debris, there's like everything floating down the river. There was lawn chairs, and there was a ladder. So I was sitting there trying to catch some of this stuff with my fishing pole, like trying to snag it with my hook and line, from the bridge. It was floating down the river underneath the bridge. This thing, it went over the shore, and it picked up people's lawn chairs. And it picked up. I even saw a ladder. It looked like a boat ladder. It had the floats attached to it. Anyway, all this stuff was floating down the river, and I had this feeling like, oh, thank God that thing didn't kill me. So that was the story of me, George, and the tornado. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye for now.